Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Saddleback webinar. My name is Liz Mangus, Literacy Specialist with Saddleback Educational Publishing. We will get started right at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. As usual, we like to log on just a little bit early, so those of you who may be new here, that way you can get sort of accustomed to this format. If by some chance you're still new to Zoom after the 2020 we've had. So on the bottom of your web browser window, there is a control bar, and that is where you will find your chat and your Q&A icons. So this is very important because this is how you're going to communicate and interact with us today. The chat feature is how you will communicate with all of your fellow attendees, and the Q&A area is where you can ask questions either of Saddleback or of our presenter today. Most of you will be using the chat most of the time. So just a little tip about using the chat. Whenever you enter text into the chat box, please make sure there's a little drop-down menu there. Please make sure you select all panelists and attendees before you hit that send button. That way, everybody who is with us today can see what it is you have to say. I know many of you also sometimes accidentally put your questions in the chat box. That's fine, that's okay too, but try to remember that if you put them in the Q&A box, we will be able to get to them a little bit more quickly. In terms of handouts and resources from today's webinar, we will be putting links to that in the chat area for you. We also know many of you are on Twitter. We are too. What a coincidence. So is Michelle, our presenter today. So while we're waiting, if you could go to Twitter, follow us, say hello, let everybody know you are joining us today. And we've got a few more minutes before we start. So let's bring in Michelle and see how she's doing. She's in the Houston area. What's going on there in the Houston area, Michelle?
Hi, Liz. It's a beautiful day, and I'm super excited to be here because, you know, there's just nothing captivating on TV to watch right now. So just kidding.
No? What about Days of Our Lives? Is that still
Right.
But am I dating myself? Is that
Yes,
still
no.
a thing? I don't know.
No, it's a beautiful day, and I'm excited to be here, and I welcome all of you from all over. We already have some folks chiming in. Indiana, awesome. Yay.
Now is the time. Please go ahead and jump in. Let us know where you're joining us from. We always like to see, do we have all areas of the country represented today? Do we have any international folks today? We'll see. We've got Southern California and Seattle, Washington. Hello, West Coast. Hi from Michigan. Nice to see Michigan here.
McAllen. Yay. Hi, McAllen.
Yay, McAllen. San Antonio.
This is my favorite part of webinars is seeing where everybody's from.
Hi, Jody. We'll have Jody on presenting for us in a few weeks.
Howdy, San Louisville, Texas, Phoenix. Hi, Jody. New York, Kilgore. Joseph from Kilgore. Hi, Joseph.
Oh, I know Joseph.
You do know Joseph, Liz. That's where you and I met. We were hanging out with Joseph.
That's right. Oh my gosh.
That's right.
Oh my gosh, that was not that long ago, but it seems like forever ago.
100 years ago. 100 years ago. Last week lasted 9 months, right?
I know, exactly.
Houston, lots of Texas folks representing.
Yes. So I have a question for all of you out there, because we have a couple more minutes. Our topic today is going to be assessment. So when we say the word assessment, especially in the current context, what comes to mind? If you could boil it down to just like 2 or 3 words. When I say assessment, what comes to mind? Pain, joy, pain. What is it? This might be too hard of a question. Do we have any takers? Let's see. Outcomes. Okay. Locating the gaps. Yeah. Stress. Stress is a big one. Yes. Hello, Sci-Fair ISD. Understanding. Opportunity gap. Okay. Finding those gaps and trying to make sure that we are addressing them, especially if we're teaching remotely, is a huge challenge. And hopefully we are going to tackle that today. Bridging the gaps. Yes, exactly.
I like that, yeah.
Bridging the gaps. Process, beginning, intervention, and instruction. So Joy, it seems like you're thinking about this. I don't know, when I read those words, Joy, I envision like a cycle in my head. So we're trying to diagnose and intervene, plan our
Mhm.
instruction, adjust our instruction.
Understanding.
Yes, a circle. Okay, good. See, I feel better now. Thank you. Stress for both the students and the teachers. Yes. Hopefully, it doesn't have to be that way, but I can certainly understand that response given the current context. So, and reteaching. Yes. hmm Some great replies here. So, hopefully, Michelle, this is giving you some ideas and of who we're talking to and what their
Excellent.
concerns are. So, why don't we go ahead and officially launch because people are going to be eagerly awaiting this information. So, we are obviously talking about assessment, assessing student learning, especially if you are working remotely with your students. Everything about remote teaching and learning has been a challenge, but assessment is one that I think we need to have more conversation around. And so thank you so much to Michelle for joining us and taking the time to put this together for us to give us something to think about and helpfully improve our practice. Now, Michelle, this is not your first go around on a Saddleback webinar, and it looks like many people who are joining us today already know you, but not everybody does. So let me go ahead and formally introduce you. So Dr. Michelle Izquierdo has worked as a teacher, instructional specialist, and education program specialist. Her doctoral research focused on the factors contributing to the success of high school newcomers, and she continues researching and presenting on this important topic. She is a consultant with Seidlitz Education and author of the book Pathways to Greatness for ELL Newcomers. Here it is, one of my favorites. Great book. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us. I'm going to let you take it from here, and we'll come back at the end for some questions.
Perfect. Oh, I was following your mouse just now, Liz, instead of mine.
Oops.
I was like, what's happening right now?
Zoom problems. Those are Zoom problems.
Right. Hi, guys. I'm excited to be here. So this webinar grew very organically the last time I presented. I don't know, it's been about a month or so ago. And some of the conversations that we had during that webinar and many of the questions we had were about assessment. So I totally invited myself back to Saddleback to do this webinar. And, this was a little bit out of my wheelhouse because well, I guess all of us, right? This whole idea that our world is just completely insane right now with whether our kids are at home, whether they're in front of us, and how that literally changes on a day-to-day basis. So it's definitely a paradigm shift for all of us. We're all, and I'm probably going to say this phrase a number of times today, we're building the airplane while we're flying it. So I've been, spending about the last month researching this topic and asking people, even my family and my friends who have students who are being remotely schooled, and how are you being assessed? What are your thoughts on that? Stalking social media and just kind of collecting all of this and bringing it to you today. So hopefully we'll leave here with some ideas and not just more questions about this topic. So here's what we're going to hope to accomplish in our little bit of time together. I'm going to explore some varied and alternative approaches to monitoring students' learning during remote instruction. And I'll talk a little bit about what do I mean by monitoring students' learning, because I think one of the really important pieces that deserves a lot of consideration is the assessing versus grading piece. And I know as a young teacher or as a less experienced teacher, I probably got those two things mixed up, or I tended to interchange those two things. And there are some very distinct differences between grading, collecting grades, and assessing a student. So I'm definitely going to differentiate that for us today as well. I do have a quick question. I know we've already done a little bit of the chat, but if you could just really quickly open up your chat box and tell me, it's just in a few words as possible, what are some learning assessment challenges for you right now under this new normal? And I call it the new normal because who knows how long our life is going to look like this. So just take a quick minute. What are some challenges regarding assessment specifically that are new as we go through each day with some of our kids at home, some of them at school, a little bit of both? And I'm going to just take a minute to read these while we're scanning. Okay, understanding versus Googling, excellent. I'm speed reading. I'm not going to read all of them, but I just want to kind of look for themes here really quick. Okay, I hope that. Perfect. Okay, all right. Who took the, okay, perfect. So just kind of a little sampling then of what are some challenges. And obviously I can't read all of those, but it looks like just the sampling that I just kind of scanned through. Hopefully I'll address many of these as we go through this webinar today. So with that being said, what are schools doing? And here's, I'm sure there are other options, but here's kind of what I have categorized this into in terms of, are we still doing a pass-fail structure regardless if our kids are at home or being virtually taught? Are we, I'm sorry, let me back up. Have we transitioned to a pass-fail? So you either pass or you fail, and there's a lot of gray area in there. Are you still doing a traditional grading practice where my at-home kids are being held to the exact same, I don't want to say standard, but the same protocols as my students who are being taught remotely? Or are you flexible depending on the kid or even the kid's situation, or is it something I haven't thought of yet? So if you could put this number in the chat, your grading, collecting data, is it pass fail? Is it regular, the same as it always looked? Is it depends on the kid or something entirely different? And I think this will be very interesting and telling as well. So a lot of number twos. Okay, great. A lot of traditional grading practices, regardless of where we are and what we're doing. I see a couple of threes, which means we are varying that depending on our kids and our situation. Mostly twos. I'd be interested to calculate statistically what this is. Maybe Liz, you can save that chat for me. I'd be curious to see what that comes out to be. Lots and lots of twos.
We can definitely save this chat for you.
Oh, wow. Look at that. Yeah. Okay, I like that. Okay, Patricia says newcomers were doing a pass-fail structure. Everybody else is a two, traditional grading practices. Perfect. Okay, so that's very interesting. I'm actually surprised that there are that many twos. Excellent. So I want to have a quick conversation about grading versus assessing. And I think one of the things I struggled with as I prepared this webinar and as I've been thinking about this topic for the past several weeks is many of the questions that y'all submitted to Liz ahead of time, and even some of the questions that I solicited from some of my friends and colleagues, it sounded like there was a lot of confusion or misinterpretation on my part, maybe, or even on their part, is, are we grading or are we assessing? And I think we really need to make this distinction before we move forward. And this is a little teacher 101, or even if we're more seasoned, more veteran teachers, I think it's really important to remind ourselves that there is a distinction between grading and assessing. So when we grade, we are evaluating. We are evaluating. That word evaluate is really important. We're evaluating students' individual learning and performance. And with that comes some other variables, some other data points that we might consider: the student's attendance, their participation, their effort. So there's lots of other pieces that comes into this grading piece. Whereas if we're assessing, what is the purpose of an assessment? The purpose of an assessment is to measure a student in order to improve student outcomes or student learning. And that means we use that information. And I'm glad that Liz asked that question at the beginning: what does assessment mean to you? Because we saw this, Joy, especially in your little circle that you just mentioned. It's this idea that we take this information that we're measuring and we use it to adjust and change things as we go forward. So I think it's really important when we are asking questions, well, okay, but Michelle, what about this? The first question I would ask if I had the opportunity to talk one-on-one with many of you is, what is your goal? Is your goal to collect a grade for this student, or is your goal to really assess this student? Because I think if we really look at this piece of assessment, it opens the door to a lot more options than just that number two. Because to me, if we're talking about grades, and I know it's kind of the same thing, and you're thinking, well, how is this different? But traditional grading practices versus, are we really collecting data to move students forward? And I'm going to make an argument that we need to change what we're doing. That a lot of us are doing, and I say us, I don't mean individual teachers, I mean even as districts, even as states, we haven't adapted, whether or not it's grading or assessment, we haven't adapted that to the fact that many of our students are learning remotely, that on the horizon that could be a lot more students. We just really don't know what that's going to look like. So my focus today is, again, are we evaluating or are we measuring? And there's a difference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this second bullet here. So here's another sort of way to look at it. Grading is best for evaluating large amounts of student data, whereas assessing is more appropriate for measuring a student. So if we're assessing, that's where I'm moving forward with our webinar today. Lots and lots and lots of different ideas and lots of different ways to collect data on student achievement. Now, unfortunately, if your question is, well, how do I take grades? Maybe that's another webinar for another day, or even another piece. I think it's beyond the scope of one day or one 45-minute webinar to cover both of these. So I want to look at this through the lens of assessing. What are some ways that I can collect data on how my kids are achieving, how are they accomplishing, and how are they meeting state standards? Now, if you want to make the connection now, you could say, based on these ways that I'm selecting on how I measure students, you could get some grades from that as well. But I think we need to try to change our paradigm shift. It's not just about holding all kids accountable to the exact same way we're going to assess or take grades. And I think part of what helps my mind with this is, having spent so many years teaching newcomers, this intuitively, I had to figure out lots of different ways even to take grades or assessing these different kids. So even as a high school biology teacher, having 120 different kids, I might have had 50 different ways to determine whether or not a kid knew something, and it looked completely different. So I think we also need to revisit this idea of differentiation. Really, really important right now. Absolutely important. And really give ourselves permission to think outside of the box. And it's going to look different for different kids. And even the grading might look different to different kids. And I know there's a lot of other moving parts in there, but let's just move forward with this idea that, what are some ways we can collect data on our kids to move them forward instructionally? So the first thing is, I want to remind us, when we're planning our lessons, to begin with the end in mind. And this was something that I needed to remind myself as a young teacher. The first thing we need to consider is, what the heck do we want students to learn? I mean, what do we need them to learn? How are we going to gather evidence that they learned that? So at the end of this unit, at the end of this particular piece of study, what do I hope they learn out of it? How am I going to measure that? Once I have that determined, then I can ask myself, okay, what lessons and activities am I going to do that's going to lead to that outcome? And I think this is something different that a lot of teachers maybe do, is they think about what great lessons and activities I'm going to do. And oftentimes, and I know I'm guilty of this as a young teacher, the assessment piece, considering how I was going to assess this, came absolutely dead last. So first of all, I want you to think about this. And what we're going to focus on today is bullet number 2. How am I going to gather evidence of student learning? That is my lens through which we're going to view the rest of our time together. So speaking of assessment, here's a little, again, Assessment 101. I'd be completely remiss if I didn't quickly review practically every resource I've looked at. Does a quick little, at least, paragraph at the beginning, formative versus summative assessments. And I think this is really important, because one of the things I'm reading about over and over again in the research is definitely taking us more towards these formative assessments. So again, definition of assessment is, we're basically determining what a kid knows, what they understand, and what they can do. And or these are the 3 reasons why we give opportunities, why we provide opportunities for students to be assessed. So what do they know? What can they do? What do they understand? And the whole purpose of this is so that we can take that information and figure out, what can we change? How can we approach this from a different perspective? So of course, formative versus summative. Formative assessments are part of your teaching process. These are things you do hopefully throughout a lesson, while you're presenting each standard, while you're presenting each piece of standard. You stop, you ask for, you solicit responses from students, you provide lots of useful feedback to students, and you adjust your instruction accordingly. So, all right, students, before I move on, I just introduced you to the first characteristics of the la la la. Let's check for understanding really quick. So what I call these are along the way. So these are the things that we do along the way. And if you think about remote learning, remote learning, and anywhere else in the presentation you see RL. That's remote learning, virtual learning, whatever we're calling it. It's when the beautiful child's not in front of you, they're on the other side of a computer screen. So remote learning really lends itself well to formative assessments, short quizzes, total response signals, which are thumbs up, thumbs down, having students respond to things in the chat. And they tend to be low stakes. They tend to be very low stakes, which means there's not a lot hinging on whether or not you show me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It lowers the affective filter or the anxiety level of students because they know you're doing this to collect feedback to adjust your teaching and their learning. And we can compare that to summative assessments. And this is going to determine the overall achievement of a student on a particular unit, a particular topic. They're much higher stakes. There are things like our unit exams, our final exams, our state assessments. And it sounds like a lot of the questions that Liz and I have been fielding regarding assessments are about the summative assessments and how we can pull them off with virtual learning. So I always think about them as the stuff we do at the end, right? So what does all this have to do with what we're doing today? Well, let's talk about pre-COVID. Remember those days when there's lots of toilet paper and you could actually like touch people's hands and you actually saw the bottom of people's faces. So pre-COVID, most of the assessments we gave our kiddos strongly depended on them being physically present in class. And we might give them a project or something to do, but typically our assessments, even our grades for those assessments, you had to be in class. So I could hand you your multiple choice paper and pencil tests, right? Now, whether we have remote learners, whether we have face-to-face learners, whether we have a little bit of both, and I put a question mark in there because who knows what it's going to look like in a few weeks, right? We need to find some alternate approaches to measuring student learning. And I think this is, back in March, it was just survive till the end of the day. And all of these people came out with all of these ideas and webinars and everybody's head was spinning, like just we're talking about teaching. How do I just get the information across to kids? But I think the longer we spend in these remote learning situations or in these hybrid learning situations, we're getting better and better. And it's just like a new teacher. If you think about the analogy of being a new teacher, when I was a new teacher, I just was in survival mode. I just wanted to stay a day ahead of the kids and survive. But as I got more and more, my skill set increased with teaching, then I could start focusing on more specific things and improving and moving forward on more specific things. So I think as a teaching entity, this is where we're at. So we're getting better and better at this remote learning. So now we need to specifically think about changing our approaches to how we're measuring that learning. And I think as we progress, we'll see fewer and fewer schools keeping that number 2 option, which is business as usual. Let's just keep assessing the same way we've been assessing, even though our instructional is completely different now, and moving on to ideas number 3, where we're either going to be super flexible depending on the students and their situation, or even that number 4, which was, I haven't even thought about what this assessment might look like. So I think this is definitely something that's evolving right now, is what could be these alternative approaches to measuring student learning and making it less and less about that grade at the end of the day. So without doing a complete literature review, guys, here's what I found, having spent a solid month looking at this topic. There's very limited research on what summative assessments look like for remote learning. There's just not a lot out there. So helpful life hack here, if anybody wants to get their doctorate or their PhD, there's your research topic, right? Summative assessments during remote learning, because the information is very scarce. And if the information is scarce, it means the ideas are as well. But there seems to be a lot of issues concerning test security, as noted in many of the things that you guys put in your chat. Certainly an issue there. So let's talk about formative assessments now. What does the research say about formative assessments during remote learning? Well, it's pretty unanimous, guys. It says that as more and more of our students are learning remotely, we need to embrace formative assessments more and more. And there's a lot of philosophical issues here. There's a lot of but Michelle's, and we could debate this, but this idea of I'm offering for your consideration to move more and more towards those formative assessments. Remember, our goal is Are kids learning what I'm teaching? And really just not necessarily abandoning this idea that I have to give, it's not effective teaching if I don't give this big unit test at the end of the unit. When I taught newcomers, very few of my newcomers took that unit test at the end of the unit. I did a lot of formative assessment along the way, had a lot of one-on-one conversations with students, and I think that that mindset took me a while to adapt, but if I can prove at the end of this unit that this kid learned the material and this kid learned the material, I differentiated the instruction. Why is it not appropriate for me to differentiate the assessment? If the goal of my assessment is to determine whether or not a kid learned what I taught them. So also there's this idea that, not just teachers are teaching our kids. There's a lot of parents turned teachers out there. Kids are getting a lot more support with learning from their folks at home and their parents at home. So the bottom line is, again, what's our goal? Are kids absorbing what I'm teaching them? And there's lots of different ways that I can determine that besides that test, that multiple choice test at the end of the unit. So what are some other considerations that we might want to ponder? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I felt like this warranted revisiting this particular topic. If this part interests you now, this was a little bit about what my previous webinar was about, that this idea that there are technology challenges, and I actually saw a couple of people in the chat mention this as well. Lack of access to technology and some other issues that might be of concern. So I created a couple of slides just to kind of revisit this idea that when we're considering assessments, remember our whole lens today is how are we measuring student learning? So as we're considering how to most effectively do that, we definitely need to be considering the diversity of student situations. We had diverse students that sat in front of us in class. Now there's this whole other universe of diversity that we need to think about and consider when we plan for students, because now their home world is so much more overlapping school world now. So be aware and acknowledge students' remote learning factors, things like access to technology. Do I have the internet? Is my internet fast enough for what you're asking me to do with it? Do I have the hardware? Yeah, I have a computer, but the webcam doesn't work, or my teacher's expecting me to print something or have access to that. So many of our kids don't have access to all of this. And, this whole seeing this through the lens of a child of poverty could be another webinar, but I mentioned this previously in our other webinar. As a child of poverty, I wouldn't have had access to all of these things when I was a student if life had been like that back then. So I often reflect as a student, let me try to think this, if I was the student now that I was then in terms of the socioeconomic level of my family, I certainly would not have had access to this. So I would have been that kid that would have needed you to come up with some kind of alternatives for me, or I likely would have failed. And I didn't go into a lot of detail on this, but before we went live, we were having this conversation about all these news articles we keep seeing about students' failure rates and how students are just failing left and right all over the country. And as an educator and as an advocate for at-risk students, and as someone who used to be an at-risk student, and many of you know that my mom was an immigrant, so I came from a language minority family, my heart breaks as I see these just astounding statistics of all of the kids who are failing. And I think we are failing our students, and there's probably a lot of confusion again over, are you grading kids or are you assessing kids? And maybe moving a little bit. I'm not suggesting we completely abandon what we used to do, but this idea that if there's this many kids failing, we might need to do a lot of self-reflection and figure out what else is going on and what can we do to prevent that. Also, with that being said, some other obstacles: time to access technology. If you've got one computer but a family of four where there's two kids that need to get on for virtual learning, plus a mom and a dad that might be needing a computer for their work, there's a lot of issues with access to technology. So yeah, I have a laptop, but I only can use it for certain amounts of time during the day. And then, okay, so fine, I have the technology, but you know what? My aunt and my uncle are also living with us right now. And, there's just all these other variables that we might not consider. So even a quiet place to work is sometimes often a challenge for our kids. So think about these things as you plan for assessments. And I hopefully many of you are already thinking maybe we need to move away from that too, where it's traditional, the same thing we've been doing, we're going to keep doing, and maybe start thinking, could we differentiate based on some of these factors? How many of kids have that parent and familiar support at home versus how many kids that don't? And again, to bring up my own personal reflection, when I was a small child, my mom had 3 different jobs at one point. So certainly that would have been a challenge from my perspective. So I guess, developing a lot of empathy too for what kids can and have access to when they're trying to access the assessments that we're telling them they need to do. Essentially, guys, we can't discriminate against a child with remote learning challenges. Uh, just like we talk about when we talk about for English language learners, I often say a newcomer cannot be failing because he or she doesn't speak English. We cannot fail a child because he or she cannot access the technology that we are expecting for remote learning. And I don't have all of the answers. Again, I'm offering that for consideration, that I think a lot of the problem is children, it's not whether or not they understood the content, it's whether or not they have the bells and whistles that they need to access the assessment. So I think we need to be really careful on that. So, and then we can go into this conversation about synchronous challenges are not the same as asynchronous challenges. So the challenges you have with a student might look differently when they're at home. So we're going to talk a little bit about asynchronous and synchronous challenges. And the solution here is, my access to technology is not an issue as long as you give me flexible options. So yeah, I can't get on the class and join the class at a certain time during the day, but if you're willing to be flexible on that, maybe that's an option. So I also think abandoning this black or white, can you or can you not kind of mentality, and in trying to come up with a happy medium, and again, providing that flexibility and providing that differentiation for students that they need right now. Other things, socioeconomic status, I mentioned that. Language learners, these are all considerations that need to be made when we're thinking about assessments. And we begin to think about ways to differentiate assessments based on these things. Computer usage skills, somebody said that earlier, our younger students don't know how to type, don't know how to access the keyboard, but that's not necessarily just true with some of our younger students. Many of our SLIFE students and SIFE students who've never been around technology, that might be an obstacle for them. So again, are we differentiating? Are we separating the fact that they don't know how to access the technology versus they don't understand the content? So lots of things that we need to keep in mind, lots of layers here and moving parts, even familiarity with certain applications. So lots of things. Let's talk about synchronous assessment. So this is where we're assessing kids. I'm on the computer. My beautiful class is joining me. They're over here on my Brady Bunch squares, and I'm doing some kind of assessment. It's real time. I'm getting immediate feedback from all students at the same time. That's great. Show me a thumbs up if you type your answer in the chat. Let's go to breakout rooms and talk about it. And then there's asynchronous. We're still assessing. We're still collecting data on student achievement. This is when, obviously, we know asynchronous means we, as the educator, is separated from the kiddo by time and by space. This is when kids are completing a variety of assignments, activities, projects. They're all doing it at different paces. And here's what's important, guys. This is my take-home message for these last few slides. Asynchronous methods should be given priority when students have varying degrees of remote learning access and challenges. Everybody take a pause, count to 10. Just kidding, count to 2. Deep breath, 1, 2. This sentence is really important. Asynchronous, I want you to do that. Asynchronous methods are most important, should be given priority when students have varying degrees of this. So that means, again, the magic word is differentiation. So if I've got a lot of different kids who have different degrees of access to technology, different times they can get on the computer, all of those variables that we just mentioned, I might want to lean more towards asynchronous. But Michelle, all of these other concerns y'all had in the chat earlier, if I give an assessment asynchronously, how am I going to know that the student is doing it? And hopefully I'm going to address some of these as we get through the rest of these slides, but I just really wanted to take a pause here and offer this for your consideration. So what makes an assessment effective? This is just some basics. an assessment is effective when it's valid, when it's timely, when it's constructive, and when it's specific. So allow me to talk briefly about each one of these. Assessment is valid. I don't care what kind of assessment we're talking about, formative, summative, show me a thumbs up when you can, or multiple choice test at the end. An assessment is valid when we test what we say we're testing. I mean, it seems obvious. Does the assessment align to the stated learning objectives? I mean, are you testing what you say you're testing? And I think this is an important consideration as well. Does the cognitive skill of the assessment match the cognitive skill of the objective? So if your cognitive skill of the objective is at the knowledge level, but all of a sudden at the assessment, you're asking kids to apply or synthesize that knowledge, or vice versa. So really thinking about, are we at the same level of blooms for the assessment as we are for the objectives? And I think there's an exception here, and I'll offer that to you here in a few minutes, and that's project-based learning, and that's portfolios and things that we might ask kids to do. Timely. That's when we use the data to the assessment to make real-time adjustments to the instruction. Back to this idea of, why are you doing this? Are you doing this to measure student learning, or are you doing this to get a grade? Because if you're doing it to measure student learning, then the idea in your mind, back to joy in your circle that you mentioned at the beginning, we take this data, this information that we gather from these assessments, and we make adjustments to our instruction based on student performance. Because our goal with the assessment is, are kids understanding what I'm teaching? And if not, what else needs to change and what do I need to do? Constructiveness. This is something we often don't think of when we are creating assessments, but what is gained from the student's perspective? This slide is really important. From the student's perspective, the assessment should help kiddos identify misunderstandings, should help the kiddos improve. Kids should be able to use their assessment data to make improvements. Kids should be able to understand the learning goals. And again, this is different. So are we just taking a grade, or do we really want to move students forward with this assessment? And if you're already thinking, well, if I really want to move students forward with this assessment, maybe I don't wait till the end to do it. This is all more argument for why these formative assessments might be a direction that we need to start moving towards as our kids are remote learning. It's not just about the grade at the end. It's about, I need data along the way to make sure my kids are meeting the goals that I'm setting forth for them. And then specificity, we just mentioned that already about what happens, or sorry, does the assessment match the lesson? So with that being said, let me check my time. Perfecto. Here's some ideas and strategies. And I want to be very clear, guys. I would be beyond arrogant and presumptuous to think that in a 45-minute webinar, I could solve all of your problems. I don't think anybody is to that point yet. We are at such an unprecedented time in our educational history with regard to what do we do with this. I think these are just ideas and strategies, and there's not one solution. I think that we start looking at individual students, start leveraging their challenges and their needs, and coming up with appropriate assessments for kiddos. And if your butt Michelle at this point is, it sounds like it's going to take me 88 years to assess on one topic, I don't think that's necessarily true. And well, let's continue, and you'll see what I've got for you here. So first of all, you don't have to assess everything. Again, I think this speaks to my experience with teaching newcomers and really having to look at the biology, high school biology TEKS, and being so overwhelmed with the sheer amount of information that students had to learn, and distilling it down to what do kids need to know and what's nice to know. And I think this is what you do with your PLCs, your grade level teams. You might even have conversations with the teachers in the next grade level. What do kids need to know? Because we've all realized now that with remote learning, everything takes twice as long as it usually takes, or longer. I don't have an exact number, but we can't possibly get through everything that we've traditionally gotten through. So what do we need to know? Let that guide your assessments. I mean, that's just really basic. And shifting to a new assessment mindset. This is, I guess I could have called the whole webinar this. We need to shift to a new assessment mindset. I don't have all the answers, but I think it's definitely, it would behoove us all to reflect, what can we keep from the way we traditionally assessed kids prior to COVID-19 and what absolutely needs to change. We're not maybe necessarily changing it right this minute today, but we're going to put that on our list and say, we need to think about this. This is not working. All of our kids are failing. What else can we do? And it might be innovative ideas that we haven't even thought of yet, but I definitely think it warrants a conversation for all of us. So part of this shifting to a new mindset is considering frequent and diverse low stakes formative assessments rather than, or in addition to, I should say, or rather than those formal end of the unit tests. And I know state assessments is a whole nother beast, guys. I'm not reading the comments, but I can bet that someone's already mentioned that. This idea of balancing what am I doing for kids now? What are best practices for kids now versus what does the state expect me to do at the end of the year? And we have people coming to us from all over the country and other countries as well. So it would be beyond the scope of our webinar today to start talking specifically about state expectations. But our kids right now, in terms of, are they passing, are they failing, are they getting it? Frequent and diverse low stake formative assessments. Diverse means we're gonna have a lot of different ideas, and I'm gonna use these different ideas depending on which kids I have and what their needs are. I like this idea because this means that my toolbox of assessments is highly adaptable to whatever happens next Monday. Right now, I've got, I don't know, 18 kids virtual, and that could change at the drop of the hat. I mean, literally day by day. If a kid gets sick in school and they have to quarantine, bam, now you got all your kids back at home. So this idea that the more diverse assessments you have in your toolbox, you can pull those out, and they're highly adaptable, they're ever changing. Smaller increments of assessment also help build confidence with our kids. I mean, we think as educators we lost our confidence. I can't tell you how many teachers have told me, I feel like a first year teacher all over again. Man, imagine how these kids feel, right? And also it increases engagement. If I feel completely spent and completely overwhelmed, I'm talking about the student, not just the teachers, right? Of course my engagement goes down because I'm just done. And if my teacher's continually to assess me and my grades are, yeah, kids are checking out. So I think Tim said it at the beginning of this webinar. My lovely colleague, Carol Salva, has said it multiple times to me, this idea that we got to keep kids coming to the table. We got to keep them in the game. So we got to be super flexible. We have to build that engagement. We have to increase that motivation because a lot of our kids aren't even playing the game with us anymore. And we need to make sure we do everything we can possible to keep kids into the game. And then also this idea of frequent, diverse, low stakes formative assessments keeps kids from falling behind. Why is that? Well, because I'm going to catch them. Every time I do one of these formative assessments, I'm providing a safety net. I'm collecting some data. So I don't wait till the end of the unit to realize, man, I lost that kiddo. He's completely overwhelmed and completely lost. Because again, kids get too overwhelmed, they just stop coming, and we don't want that. So other ways to shift to a new assessment mindset, I just mentioned we got to increase that motivation. And one of the things we can do that is by encouraging collaboration. Okay, I'm totally gonna, y'all don't throw school supplies at me, right? Group-based assessments. But Michelle, how am I going to know the individual student? Again, lots of these, take that traditional assessment hat off for a second and just take some of these into consideration. We want to increase motivation. What is our goal? Remind yourself our goal. Are kids learning this? Are they getting what I'm expecting them to get out of this? So it's not about the grade right now. It's about collecting data on whether or not kids are understanding. And I came across this, y'all. This citation is in the resource information. These ideas that these 21st century skills. Okay, seriously, critical thinking, communication, creativity, media and technology skills, all of these skills can be sort of intertwined with what we're assessing for our content. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on 21st century skills, but y'all definitely check out that article that's at the end of my PowerPoint resources. It's got some really great ideas on how you can incorporate these skills into any assessments that you're doing for any grade level. And one of the things I like to do when I do any kind of presentations like this is I don't like to give you all of these great ideas and say, okay, great, now go out into the world and spend 5 weeks pulling, trying to find all examples of all of these. I'm going to get to the end of this webinar and I already have lots of sites at the end of my PowerPoint. You can just click on it, find your subject area and click on it. So I'm not just going to give you all these great ideas and then be like, peace out. I'm going to give you some actual places you can go and look at some of these things without having to spend a lot of time looking for your own specific examples. So embrace short quizzes. They give practice on key concepts. They provide multiple opportunities for you to provide feedback to your kiddos. Again, it's low stakes. It's not just about the grade. And I think that's something else that we can keep reminding ourselves of, and our students maybe, and even the parents of our students, that it's not just about the grades. A lot of our kids are in survival mode. Their parents are in survival mode on behalf of the kid. And as a mama bear, I can't, just being honest with y'all, my kid's failing miserably and I'm going to help them so I can get that grade up. But if we reframe the purpose of these quizzes, it's not just that grade. So you don't need to get your mom and dad to help you, because I really need to know whether or not you know this, because if you don't know it, I'm going to figure out a different way to present it to you. So I think when we lower that anxiety level for our kids, maybe there's not going to be such a profound need to, or profound desire to cheat. It's about, do you know this? I really need to collect this data. So don't worry about cheating. If you don't know it, that's fine. I need to know that so we can move on and figure out what's going on. Other things, moving beyond simple facts. Can we take whatever we've taught kids and have them apply it to a scenario? It's a heck of a lot harder to cheat, because you and I are going to come up with different solutions to whatever problem that you ask us to solve. What is the best multiple choice answer? Maybe there's different answers, and each kid's going to tell you which one's best and why. So that means I don't necessarily have the same answer as Liz, because I'm going to justify my choice and she's going to justify her choice, and we're both going to get credit because we both just demonstrated to you that we understood what the heck you've been teaching us for the past week. Hey, which one is wrong and why is it wrong? Pick one of these that's wrong and tell me why. Liz is going to pick a different one than I'm going to pick. So again, we have some differentiation there. It's not just about how many, can you answer 20 questions about this, but can you explain your answer? Can you elaborate on your answer? Can you develop a product based on what I've taught you? And again, guys, I know all of this is not going to be relevant to every content area. We're filling our toolbox. We're filling our toolbox with lots of different ideas here. Do you already have projects that you do in classes that can now be your assessment? So could you update that project? Could you make it flexible so that there's different avenues that kids could approach that on? Okay, blasphemy here. Open notes and open book. But Michelle, how do you know they're learning it if it's an open book test? Well, again, is it the basic knowledge and memorization that you're looking for, or rather the application of that knowledge? Because if you need to look in the book for, adenine and thymine go together, but that's, DNA unit, but instead I'm going to give you this problem where there's a genetic disorder and I need you to tell me that if adenine is substituted to thymine, what's going to happen, or whatever, or sorry, guanine, whatever that looks like. So I'm taking that basic knowledge and I'm applying it. So now we're at the application level. So if you need to look in your book, again, this is just one way to approach this. And let me tell you why I wrote this in here. I asked my niece and nephew are both being taught remotely. And I was like, listen, tell me what your tests look like. And my nephew was telling me that they do open notes and open book, but it's not just, is it A, B, C, or D, that they have to use whatever information they're looking for in the book and explain. He says they do a lot more elaboration, a lot more explanation. And he told me even with the book and the notes in front of him, it's actually more challenging now because he just can't bubble the right answer. He's got to be able to explain it. So there's at least worth investigating or thinking about that a little bit. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit, let me check my time. I'm going to talk a little bit about performance tasks. And there's several slides here. I'm going to click through from some examples, but I really like this idea of moving away from, not abandoning it totally. Remember, guys, it's not one or the other. We're just adding to our toolbox. Moving away from rote memorization at that knowledge level and really asking kids to apply their knowledge to new situations. And why do I like performance-based assessments? Well, I don't even think I have a bullet on this, but it's hard to cheat because, it's more authentic The way Liz approaches it is going to be completely different than the way I approach it. It's very open-ended, so there are multiple perspectives that you can explore, and it's complex tasks. It's harder to cheat off of someone when you're asking me to do something with the information that you've taught me. You could, if this works out, now hold on to your butt, Michelle's, because the first thing I thought of when I read this in one of these research articles was, well, there's no way that's going to work for something like high school physics. So I said, you know what, let me check my bias real quick. Let me read more about this and then go Google it. And y'all, guess what? I found project-based learning for high school physics. So hold on to your bias this, and let me explain this, and I'll show you a great site that I found that you can find some ideas here. So consider long-term or extended project-based learning projects. What do I mean by that? Think about this old adage: I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. I could change it and say, I do and I can let you know that I understand. So having kids, again, doing something with the information that we've taught them. So consider asking yourself this question as you're developing these projects. So I've just taught this for 2 weeks. Assuming my kids learned this, what should they be able to say about it, and what should they be able to do with it? So if we can kind of keep this as our lens when we're coming up with some of these ideas. Now, I really apologize for how blurry this is. For some reason, it showed up better on my screen earlier, if that's a thing. But this is a screenshot, and you have this citation, or you have this link at the end of the PowerPoint. But I Googled project-based learning ideas, and lo and behold, this is the first site that popped up. And here's why I love it. I know you can't hardly see it, but I'm just going to walk you through this. This first one says K through 5 ideas, 6 through 9 ideas, and 10 through 12 ideas. So there, you just click on that link and it takes you to lots of ideas. Now, content specific, because then I Googled biology project-based learning, right? And it's not that I'm always putting things through the lens of a high school teacher, but a lot of times it's harder to find some authentic assessment ideas for that more rigorous content at that secondary level. So I Googled it to see what I could find. So here's just 4 screenshots from this one link that I found. So here's a lot of ideas for biology, problem-based learning in biology with 20 case examples. So there was a case example for, out of these 20 case examples, you could use, let me rephrase that. You could use one of these case examples for everything in biology. In other words, everything you're going to teach in biology is going to be covered and assessed with one of these case examples. So pull it up, change it around, look at it, see what you think. History, social studies, project-based learning, project-based assessments. There's some for math. I know sometimes math is hard to come up with these ideas. And then a whole bunch of other additional sites. So how can I assess learning with a project? Well, if you can complete the project, back to this, if you know what I've taught you, if you've learned it, what should you be able to do with it? And doing something with it, that's that project-based learning. Don't try to think of it on your own. Go out there, Google it, see what you can come up with, click on some of these sites. And if you haven't bought into this idea that this could be a really great way to assess kids. Now you're thinking, oh my God, but I can't grade all of that. Well, the idea, guys, is you do one of these long-term projects. And you can assess several standards with one project, with one final project. Well, you want to do some more formative assessments along the way. Well, I have a solution for that as well. Take that long-term project, and this is a great activity for you to do with your PLC. Take that long-term project and try to break it up into smaller tasks. There's a couple of reasons why this is a really good idea. Number one, these smaller tasks can be individually assessed. So now you have some checkpoints along the way. You also have some grades if you want to look at it from that point too. Also, taking a larger task and breaking it up into smaller tasks makes it much more manageable for the student. So rather than wait at the end and say, where's your project? You can say, okay, Liz, our first checkpoint for our project is la, 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 la. I haven't seen that yet. Let's talk about it. Let's show me. Liz can sit down and tell you about it. Okay, there, Liz did it. Check it off for Liz. So with that, you would create some checklists for students. You would create a rubric. So you can do one project and assess several standards along the way. Now I'm going to propose this. Now this is just crazy talk right here. And I don't even have a slide for this because this just occurred to me. And I don't know how even feasible this is. But could you potentially combine some standards from different contents and assess with one project. I don't know, maybe that's like enrichment for when you get good at this. So the idea is I want you to do less work in terms of grading, but still have an effective way to measure the outcomes for students. Now, here's another one. Again, tapping into my experience teaching English language learners, do students have to show you what they learned or can they tell you? Okay, now not for all students. I'm not suggesting that you create interview slots for 120 students, but we're talking about differentiation here. Maybe this would be a way to assess some of your kids. Can you just sit down and have a conversation with kids and they can explain it to you instead of showing you? Is that a valid way to? Absolutely. You differentiated the instruction, you can differentiate the assessment. And now I know that Liz understood the steps of protein replication or protein synthesis because she just walked me through it. I showed her a picture of it and she explained to me what was happening during each one of those stages. Of course, I'm going to give her credit for that. How can you not justify giving kids credit for that if they can explain it to you based on a set of pictures that you've showed them? So before I show you my last couple of slides, I want to end the sort of informational point of our session today with this one slide. And I think this, if I could pick one slide that I would have shared with you today, it's this one. No other time in your career will this be more important than it is now. Your professional judgment, your judgment as a sympathetic, empathetic human being when it comes to assessing your children. Your professional judgment is paramount beyond anything else that you're going to do. You know your kids, you know their unique situations. None of our kids have the same situation, so why should all of their assessments look the same? We have to think about that. Differentiating on steroids, I guess you could say. And then constantly ask yourself, reflect with yourself, reflect with your PLC, reflect with your administrators when they tell you to do something a certain way. Listen, I totally appreciate your telling me that, sir or ma'am, but I'd like to sit down and have a conversation. What's our goal? Because again, is your goal grades or is it to really see if kids are learning what we're asking them to learn? Are they mastering the standard? Because if we're measuring mastery of a standard, then there's lots of ways we can do that through all of these ideas I just presented. Yeah, there's still a place for summative assessments. I'm not saying we're abandoning that, but I'm also saying there's absolutely a place, if not so more now than ever in the history of education, for these formative assessments, and ideally probably some kind of combination of the two. We differentiate depending on the student. So I like this quote. This comes from a series of webinars. So when you get tired of listening to all these fabulous Saddleback webinars, this citation is also at the end. The best assessment is simply the one that is valid, that gathers appropriate evidence in light of the goals and is reliable. And I would add that for each student. So the best assessment is simply the one that's valid for each student. And whether or not a test is valid is going to really depend on that kid. So a test that's valid for one kid is not going to be valid for another if those two kids have two completely different realities in terms of what they can do for you on their computers or whatever. And I lied. This was my last informational slide. But stay with me because I still have some pictures I want to show you really quick. This idea of order operations, love this, guys. Love this. This also came from that Orlando article. Order of operations, student relationships and wellness are number one. And Tim and Liz and I were talking about this before the webinar went live. Our kids showing up. I mean, that's like our first thing right now. We can't worry about kids are cheating if I can't even get them to come, right? So our relationships and our wellness. And I would say our mental relationships and wellness ourselves as teachers. And then the learning and then the assessment. But a lot of us right now are focused so much on number 3 and we haven't really talked or thought or reflected a lot on number 1 and number 2. So don't lose sight of your priorities when you're thinking about planning assessments. And there you go, that's that site. So a couple of other resources that I want to just quickly mention. I'm going to wrap this up in just a couple of minutes. These are also linked at the end of the PowerPoint. Y'all, this website is gold here, 75 digital tools. You'll recognize a lot of these, but I like this site because, oh wait, somebody told me about back channel chat, but I don't really feel like going into that site and looking at it. This is your cheat sheet. So this is like 75 digital tools. You can read the title of it. You can read the quick little blurb, and then you can decide if it's something you want to do. And if you want to do, you just click on it. So this is like a one-stop shopping for lots of digital tools to assess kids during learning. Many of these are formative assessments, but as I went through, a lot of these would work for summative assessments as well. So check that definitely out. Speaking of technology, leverage tech tools. There's a bunch of them. Here's some of my favorites. Quizlet. I Google super science nerd. I was like, I wonder if there's some Quizlets on biochemistry. There you go. You can use Quizlet, summative, formative, a little bit of both. We all know Kahoot. Lots of ways to assess kids using Kahoot. Edpuzzle, if you're not familiar with Edpuzzle, you can create questions at the end of each. So this is for like language arts, for reading comprehension. I believe there are other texts in there, not just for language arts, but you can create some comprehension questions at the end of paragraphs as kids read. So that's another great resource. Common Lit. Common Lit does a lot of cool things, but it also, you can create multiple choice quizzes at the end of reading opportunities. So all of these are in your PowerPoint on the list that we gave you. And of course, I love Brain Pop. Shout out to my colleague Tina Bean for this idea. We can have kids take quizzes on Brain Pop, and then they can screenshot their results and send those to us, right? So you have an asynchronous opportunity, and you can get those results just with that screenshot. And my colleague Tina Bean mentioned her kid's in 5th grade, and he's been screenshotting like that, I think she said, since 4th grade. So again, age appropriate, but add these tools to your toolbox. And then last but certainly not least, I think that's might be the same. Is this the same one? Yes. So 75. Oh, this is the one I just told you about. Sorry. 75 digital tools and apps. And then lastly, this one also is in your list, 7 ways to do formative assessments in your virtual class. So I wish we had more time so I could go through more of this with you. Liz, I went fast and furious towards the end there, love, but do you want to take it back and field a few questions and tell us what's going on next in Saddleback?
Yeah, I do. But why don't you take a minute to let everybody know what's coming up with you next? Do
Oh,
you
yes.
do you want to share that?
Yes, I forgot. I went out of order there. So yeah, yay. If you want to see my beautiful face, and I'll try to find some more Thanksgiving decor to put behind me, I will be doing some training over my resource, and it's virtual, obviously. And I'd love for you to come join me. I've divided just 2 little mini sessions. One is on creating a culture of care. So it's all about how do we create, how do we leverage culture for one? So a little bit of information on different cultures. I think it's a really great session, and that's coming up November 7th. We've already done one of the option for that. And then part 2 is how to create comprehensible lessons, virtual and in real life. And I have 2 options for that as well. And you can come to both, because I love people coming to my trainings, or if you don't have time or you're just interested in one, so one or both of them, and hopefully you can join me, and that QR code will take you to that registration page so you can take a look at that. So thank you for allowing me to do that little commercial, Liz.
Of course, absolutely. I mean, I think we have a lot of Michelle fans here, and they want to know what you're up to.
I
Um,
love
so,
it.
so maybe they can get some more information. We have lots of great questions and comments, but before we get to those, I, of course, want to let everybody know what is coming up next week on our Saddleback webinar. So we have Leanne Nicholson joining us next week, and she's going to talk about the literacy triangle. If you're looking for high impact tools to help teach your students those literacy skills, reading, speaking, writing, she is going to have some great resources for you. So please join us. You can register on our website, or of course, you will be getting an email inviting you to register for this. And we'd love to have you all come back and join us for Leanne's session. Now let's talk about some questions. There were a ton of questions, and I think there may be some more coming in right now as we speak, but we'll get to as many of them as we can. First of all, there was a significant amount of chatter, in my opinion, on project-based learning. And right when you mentioned it, somebody put in the chat, wow, what's the best way to do project-based learning in a remote environment? Huge question. I don't expect you to like answer it now, but I just thought that's That's a great question, and you provide a lot of different resources for project-based learning, but that might be one. I wanted to thank this person for making that comment because I feel like that could be another webinar topic. So
Well, there you go.
thank you.
I was going to invite
Yeah, thank you.
myself back, but I needed a topic. So there you
Well, there you go.
go.
I'll call you after
I don't know.
the
I mean,
webinar.
I
We can
think
talk
what I
about that.
would say, just really quick on that, I think to me, what overwhelms me about project-based learning is it just seems like such a huge entity. So I would have to be that teacher that's like, okay, whoa, 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 little baby steps. Like, how can I take this big project, break it up into little baby steps so I can manage it on the teacher end and my students can manage it as well. So I think that would be part of the key for that is because kids are remote, there's a lot of self-guidance that's required for that. So we would constantly have to remind kids and kind of stay on them, if you will, about that. I don't know. I'll ponder that for sure, but that's a good question.
It's a very good question, and I think in a lot of places we are very slowly making this transition into trying to teach the best way we can into this new modality we're all facing, but we're still locked into traditional mindsets. So if you weren't doing project-based learning in your face-to-face classroom, it's going to be potentially double hard, double difficult to do it in a remote setting, perhaps. I don't know. Just thinking aloud. I certainly haven't really gotten into or dug into that topic very much. But project-based learning, I feel like it holds a lot of promise um, for the virtual context. So, but I wanted to kind of bring this back around to a question that came in, which I feel like it's a very important question. And again, it may be a question that there is no good answer for, but we need to acknowledge this question and speak to it.
Sure.
The question is, what do you do if your district is expecting the same outcomes, i.e. traditional grades and assessments? So maybe I, as the teacher, have an understanding that I need to do something differently, but I am bound by expectations of my district. And I'm sort of running into that problem. And there's some tension there where the traditional structure maybe is not adapting, and therefore as a teacher, I'm facing requirements that I need to meet, but those requirements may not be as flexible as my students need them to be. So again, Michelle, I don't think there's necessarily a great answer to this, but I wanted to give you a second to kind of ponder that and speak to that, because I think it's on a lot of people's minds.
Absolutely. And I'm going to give you the Michelle answer, not the Dr. Izquierdo answer, because I think that it's a different answer, because it's the real person answer, having experienced that, and Liz, I get this question all the time, because when I talk about newcomers, especially, I think so many things that we need to adapt to our instruction to meet the needs of our students remotely are very, very similar to the paradigm shift, the complete difference, the way it looks when we're meeting the needs of newcomers. So it's the same question that I get about, well, okay, so for newcomers, it looks so different, but my principal wants it to look the same, and I feel like I'm in the middle of it. So here's the answer that I've been giving for years, and here's how even I handled it as a young teacher when I realized, wait a second, what you're asking me to do versus what I know I need to do, there's a huge disconnect. And I would say there is no straight answer, but here's some tips. You be the advocate for the kids. You stay calm, right? Stay calm and smile. Be the advocate for kids. And there's your sentence stem. Can we talk about this? What is our goal? I would always say, okay, wait, but what's our goal? What's our goal for the newcomers? And you would say, what's our goal for our remote learners? And you just take this information I've given you and turn it around and say, okay, well, are we assessing or are we taking grades? And, I think there's just this assumption, and I'm just playing the devil's advocate here, that number one, our administrators either know everything and they're completely not able to bend. Does that make sense? A lot of times, I think if you just had that conversation and said, okay, listen, I went to this webinar or I read this article, you have all of these resources now at your disposal. And this person made a really good point. Can we talk about this? And if I was a principal, I'd go like, okay, wow, I never thought about it that way. So I think maybe just giving our people that are making these decisions a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and approaching them with your, I don't want to say argument, but with your perspective on behalf of the kids. If we always keep the kids as our main goal, our main priority, I mean, I don't know, I sound like a realist. I mean, an idealist, I guess, but I think that would be my advice. Does that help? Or am I just rambling because I'm getting all passionate about this, right?
I think it helps. I think sometimes because everybody's so stressed out and feeling overwhelmed, sometimes it helps to have that gentle reminder that you can advocate for your students, and it goes back to that professional judgment that you talked about earlier. You are the expert on your students, and you need to speak up for them. So and really put their needs first and advocate for them.
Yeah,
And
be
I think
kind
it's
and be
important.
professional
Yeah.
and see what you can do with that.
Okay, we are running out of time, but I did want to get to Robin's comment around parents doing the work with their students. So Robin, Robin's been with us the whole time, and she has been active in the chat. And she mentioned early on, he or she mentioned early on that parents are doing the work, but that doesn't mean we can give up on our students, right? Maybe what we need to do is meet with them and develop that partnership and help them to become co-educators along with you, and really help them to understand that, mom, dad, when you sit down and you do this assignment, now I don't have the data that I need to adjust my instruction, and I need you to be my partner in this. And I really appreciated that comment, and I wanted to give you a moment to address that, because it's a huge concern with parents or other people in the household who are not the student potentially doing the work.
Absolutely, Robin, that's a great question. And I think it also speaks to equity. A lot of our kids don't have a parent at home that can do the work for them. So definitely, I agree, Liz. I think we take it back to the data. I think we make it, because if teachers are confusing grading versus assessing, you bet your money that the parents are. You know what I'm saying? So they see grading and assessing one and of the same. But I think if we take it back and explain to parents that this is about collecting that data. Why am I doing this? I need to know if your child has attained to this standard. And if not, I need to adjust what I'm doing. I would put it back on myself. I need to adjust what I'm doing so that I can help your child be successful. But if you continue to do the assignment, that I'm collecting your data, and I don't think you need it, and just, again, be kind, be empathetic. Empathy. Why is the parent doing this? Well, he's doing it because he doesn't want his kid to fail, or he doesn't want his kid to not be successful. But again, I think a lot of times we just don't make assumptions that if we talk to the parent, it won't make a difference. I would try that. I think there's no easy solution, just like talking to our administrators. But what is your goal in having the conversation? Go have the conversation with the parent and help explain to them that your purpose is data collection, and see if that makes a difference. Be that partner, as you said. I think that's really where we go with that.
Thank you so much. One more comment. There's so many great comments. I know we're running out of time, but I promise this is going to be the last one.
I have one after that, because I like Tyler's comment. I want to read, but you go first.
Okay. There was a comment, or it was in the feed and I've lost it. It's pretty far up, but it was about teaching. I believe it was about teaching newcomers and cultural differences, with perhaps parents not seeing the importance of the assessment, and how do we kind of work around that, or build that partnership if there is a different cultural outlook on the importance of assessment.
I mean, this is going to sound super cheesy and super contrived, but seriously, come to part 1 of my culture training, because that's one of the things we talk about is different cultures and how they view education and what priority they place on education. Okay, but without being funny, I think it really is important to, first of all, how does the culture that you're speaking of view the perspective of education, and what priority do they place on that? That's the first thing, is we have to know, first of all, what our lens is, and then secondly, and most probably more importantly, what the parent's lens is culturally. So before we can address the problem, we have to identify it, right? So I think that's what I would recommend is my first step. And then again, once you figure out what your perspective is and what their perspective is, empathy, professionalism, kindness, approach that subject with the parent and explain that the purpose again. And it's not a magical response. I mean, just having any of these conversations, whether it's with that parent, the other parent we just asked about, or your administration, it's not going to magically fix the problem, but I think that's the next logical step towards a solution.
Thank you. And so that was all for me. I know you saw something that you wanted to address in the
Well,
chat.
there's tons of stuff. I'm just like, can we just keep going for like another 4 hours? Because this is just good stuff. But Tyler Baxter, I appreciate what your comment says. You say if you have assessments figured out, taking that and figuring out how to do your grades becomes more meaningful and more of a concrete conversation. So I really love that. So I think you're right. It's how are we going to assess and, oh, can I take a grade on that, and not the other way around. So thank you for that comment. That was good.
That was a great comment. Thank you for that, Tyler. Okay, well, I am so sorry that we have to bring this to an end. Michelle, we will definitely have to have you back, whether it is
Yay!
on this topic again or a different topic. We would love to have you back. I feel like you are going onto the Saddleback webinar fan favorite list at
Well,
this
I'm
point.
stop it louder, quit it some more.
So we want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you are not familiar with Saddleback and our work and what we publish, please check us out. We have a great website, and we are on your favorite social media platform, so find us there. We would love for you to follow us, like us, hang out with us, all of that stuff, and hopefully come back for next week's webinar as well. And once again, we always like to wrap up with a big thank you. In a normal world, your job is not easy. In this current situation, in this current world, we know your job is way more complicated than it was 12 months ago at this time. So we are so grateful that you've taken the time today to join us and learn with us. And thank you so much to Michelle. And we hopefully will see all of you again next week. Take care, everybody.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.